trying to create an internal context, to understand these experiences, especially in terms of the mystical experiences. But even more remarkable were the reports of people having contact with these, sentient entities of some sort.
Yes.
Yes.
And Rick, what did these entities look like? They were consistent over the course of in other words, they all saw pretty much the same thing, didn't they?
Oh, there is, some range of the, of the representational, kind of imagery that people experienced. Some people experienced these entities looking like insects, like bees or like praying mantises. Others experienced them, in terms of cloaked kinds of, silhouetted figures. Other people experienced them as kind of humanoid. There weren't any grays to speak of, actually. This is, one of the topics that we had kind of touched upon,
yes,
in our interview, that there wasn't a whole lot of people reporting grays, the typical small, skinny creatures with, on the large heads and the like. But still, the kind of, relationship that
is it conceivable to you that an adjustment, if there was somebody who knew perhaps a little more about how the drug worked, could it be adjusted in some way to change to alter the way the entities looked? In other words, could there be a designer version of it that created a consistent vision of entities, do you think, and not?
I'm not sure, actually. These studies were taking place, before there was much interest in terms of the abduction phenomena. Yeah, we started these studies in 1990 and completed them in 1995. And, most of the volunteers didn't have much experience with, or they hadn't read much in terms of the abduction literature. They weren't really that interested in it, and I have to admit that I was not at the time either.
Now we're going to have to take a little break, Rick, and when we get back, we're going to get into this a little bit more deeply. And what is an abduction experience? Rick's probably got some very interesting insights into that. This is Whitley Strieber. We're talking to Rick Strassman, the author of DMT, The Spirit Molecule. The first, and so far, I believe, still only person in many years to do officially sanctioned research or officially approved research into hallucinogenic drugs in the form, in this case, of dosing 400 research subjects with DMT. And, Rick, let's back away, actually, a little bit from the abduction thing for just a moment. And you came to certain conclusions about what they were seeing and what that might have meant. Why don't we talk a little bit about where you eventually wound up with this?
Yeah, well, in terms of my studies, they were the first studies in humans in the U.S. in around 25 years, to give these kinds of drugs to people again. And a few studies have kind of, taken up, and continued with doing clinical research with these compounds. There was a study out of Hopkins last year which described giving a number of human volunteers a compound called, psilocybin, which comes from magic mushrooms. And actually there was a German study giving some IV DMT just a couple of years ago as well. So there has been, a slow, small resurgence of interest in these kinds of studies in human beings again. But in terms of sort of my conclusions or the kinds of experiences or the conclusions around the kinds of experiences that people had, I guess, in terms of some of the smaller level experiences, as a result of smaller doses of the drugs, those were more kind of typical of the earlier studies giving people LSD and the like, where people experienced psychological insights. Experienced a lot of interesting, perceptual kinds of things, visions and sounds, those kinds of experiences. Some of our volunteers had, near-death experiences and mystical states as well. Those were the kinds of experiences, actually, that I was most interested in seeing if my, volunteers would undergo the mystical and the near-death ones. And I was prepared for those and, had some, kind of a theoretical framework in which to understand them. But it was those, contact experiences with these entities, though, that were the most common, actually, with, in response to giving our volunteers a high dose of DMT, and those are the ones that I, struggled with the most in terms of coming up with some kind of coherent or cogent framework within which to conceptualize them.
So you were left with a sense. You see, I guess what I'm driving at is this: I'm in a position of having had another world, in effect, come into my bedroom and drag me out, and it wasn't something that happened once. I went on with this for 11 years, and then when I left the cabin where this was happening, it just stopped happening, almost as if it was very place-related. While I was there, I often had groups of people up there, and we would have situations such as on one night, a little being, we had the house filled with running low-light video cameras, because I was trying hard to document this. And on one night, this little being came in through the window and woke up one of the people, then another person in the same room. They interacted with it briefly and tried to told it to go down the hall, because it would have then been in the low-light camera range.
Right.
Then people in another room down the hall encountered it. However, later we found nothing on the videotape. Then later, the videographer who was sleeping with his wife in a roll-out couch in the bedroom saw it beside the bed, and he tried to turn on the light. And it was a classic little big-headed sort of gray. It turned into something with the head of a falcon and then disappeared. And he and his wife spent the next hour, it was early pre-dawn by this time, up awake and discussing it, whereupon my son and I, who had been sleeping in the woods because the house was so full, came up to the house and saw a hooded figure come out of the front door, go down the deck, and go across the backyard and dart off into the woods, carefully avoiding the trees. In other words, it was not going through the tree trunks, but around them. We observed that very clearly.
Right.
And when we got into the house, the videographer and his wife were standing up in the middle of the living room in a state of panic, because it had felt to them as if a wave of heat so high that they were about to be seriously burned had washed over them, just as this thing had left. And in other words, what we were looking at was a seemingly physical experience that didn't record on videotape, and it worked as much in the grammar of dream as it did in that grammar of physical laws, but wasn't certainly a group hallucination because of the structure of it. And I'm left wondering about things like that. And I was so interested in your work because it suggested to me the possibility that there may actually be something like a parallel universe, that there may be other worlds that are in some way real and alive that we can interact with using perhaps psilocybin or DMT, and that are able in a limited way to physically interact with us. And I'm just curious about your reaction to that.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's hard to really, it's hard to really prove a theory or to even, design experiments. In terms of that phenomena you described, was there any kind of, physical evidence of the presence of this being other than in people's minds?
No, the only thing that was physically present was the person, the two people. I warned them in advance not to touch these people, these little beings, because you get an allergic reaction. And there were two of them who were all swollen up because they did touch it. That was it.
Yeah, but there weren't footsteps, those kinds of things.
There was nothing. Nothing whatsoever. Nothing to fix this in the physical world in this particular instance. There was a